could you speak a little bit to the resistance that NRECA, National Renewable Electrical Cooperative Association, has had to distributed renewable energy production by farmers? I mean, a lot of us would assume that they'd be wanting that to happen, but because of the complexity that I think that you're describing, that hasn't been the case. Could you speak a little bit to that resistance and how the money in people's pockets and the experiment you're doing may impact and shift some of the association's policy or trend toward distributed renewable energy?
That is a big topic. That is a very big topic. I will say that I'll start off with maybe the back end of the question. I think that the policy changes that might occur by NRECA and, of course, the cooperatives that it's representing is probably most resisted because it's a change. And it's a change that will change how the G&Ts have to operate, and it ultimately will impact even the distribution cooperatives. And in long-established industries in particular, but in almost any industry, when they're faced with a change that could literally be a structural change to their industry, they're just going to resist. Right. So NRECA is doing its job, in effect, by just trying to represent the wishes of the cooperatives that it's representing.
Sure.
Now, the bigger part of that question, at least in my mind, the resistance on the part of the G&Ts, and in many cases the distribution co-ops to change, is coming probably from its biggest part because massive investments been made in baseload generation plants, be they natural gas or coal, but many of the electric cooperatives made major investments in coal-fired power. And you could argue that they did so because that was the economically viable option, back in the 1970s and even in the 1980s. One of the purposes of the PURPA law was to get us off of oil as a resource to use for combustion power plants, because we were importing so much oil. We had oil embargoes, and not only do those oil embargoes impact the transportation sector, but they impacted to a degree the electric utility infrastructure, because we were using petroleum and its distillates as a fuel in our combustion plants. So they said, let's diversify. And the fuel that we diversified to that was domestic and available and relatively inexpensive was coal. Now, of course, it comes with its downside, which is its emissions. So it's dirty, literally, in the sense of its particulate emissions. It's got mercury, arsenic. It's got a host of problems in what we might consider more traditional pollutants. And now, of course, it's known to be the big carbon emitter. And so this effort of having the environmental impact, the global climate change impact, and saying coal's not the darling fuel anymore, has changed the landscape. And so these investments were made in a financially viable fuel, and they are major investments. They can be hundreds of millions and billions of dollars to build these big plants. And the industry in general, and the G&Ts that are serving the rural electric cooperatives in particular, have not necessarily recouped everything they want from those investments. Now, you can complicate the answer to this question by reality. And the reality is cheap natural gas and low-cost renewables, coupled with many states' desire to increase the renewable percentage of electricity generation, has created a market now that takes those coal plants that are baseload plants and made them more challenging to utilize.
Right.
Okay, and what I mean by that is you have this intermittent resource in the case of wind and solar. Right. Baseload resources don't couple well with intermittent resources. The storage challenge has not yet been solved. That's right. So you have a baseload resource. It's a plant that can't be started and stopped in any short time period. Those baseload plants are going to be needed at some time during the day, during seasons, whatever the case may be. The investments are made in those baseload plants, and now they can't be utilized to their fullest extent because, in the case of Colorado, for investor-owned utilities, 30% of electricity by 2020 has got to come from renewables. They are intermittent. And so these guys that have made the investments in these baseload plants are saying, okay, got to keep them running, but at times of day, times of season, there's a greater demand for my renewable resource, whatever's out on the market. And so I can't get the revenue recovery on these baseload resources that I once could get. So they're saying, all right, how do we keep the renewables out? How do we avoid having to change our economic model from making big investments in large central baseload generation plants, building transmission to get it to our customers, the distribution co-ops? And how do we avoid making those changes so that we can keep those investments getting their return and recouping the money they make? Bear in mind, the G&Ts are typically cooperatives as well.
Right.
They're not for profit, right? So to me, and I think to DMEA, we look at this as we serve the retail customer. And if the retail consumer, who is a member of a not-for-profit cooperative, says, we want local and we want renewable, we see this challenge differently. We say, okay, how do we provide that to the end consumer? And we don't necessarily say, okay, even though we're a member of the G&T, that we should first and foremost protect that asset that was built. We say, how do we make this work at both the generation and transmission level and at the distribution level so that the end consumer gets what the end consumer wants? But the resistance is, this is not DMEA's opinion being expressed right now. This is Jim Heneghan's opinion. The resistance is largely because there's been a massive investment in a power plant infrastructure that is it's trying to be used continuously in a market that's going through a structural change. Where the renewables are here, they're going to be here for a long time. In fact, they're going to become the predominant resource. But no industry has ever gone through a massive change like that without scratching and clawing and kicking to resist along the way. And frankly, Bill, that's what we're seeing.
And what do you think in regards to the enthusiasm towards distributed renewable energy? Are you seeing it associated with particular ideologies, or does it transcend that? And is the enthusiasm for distributed generation broad enough and deep enough yet to counter at the further large-scale investment in generation that's centrally controlled for, say, the conversion of coal plants to gas?
I would say regionally it may depend. I think where there are resources that are very plentiful to afford a region to be able to meet its electricity needs with DG, with distributed generation, I think there are pockets that certainly that exist today. There are places where you're still going to need central generation, and you're still going to need a transmission and a distribution grid to meet the needs. Now, the one thing that could alter that, and I think ultimately will alter it, is if we can meet the storage challenge. Right. So that, we all have, I'm sure, read statistics of, if you can put enough PV panels out in the Southwest deserts, it's more electricity than is needed by the whole United States. And mathematically, that's true. But logistically, we have to be able to have the electricity available when it's going to want to be used. And so if we can sort of address the storage issue and do so in a way that's economic, then I think you do have the potential to see distributed generation meet the needs. The ideological part that maybe people don't necessarily think about that is present in our service area is not necessarily the green aspect, the environmental benefit. It's that there's an independent streak, and having distributed generation that you own and control, farmers, ranchers, a lot of those people that are in these rural areas, they appreciate that. Sure. The other thing that, and I haven't fully fleshed this out, so it's a bit of a thesis that I'm working on. Sure. One of the things that I think is going to result in continued price volatility is congestion on the grid because of transmission resources not being plentiful where distributed generation could be available, where renewable could be available. And so what could potentially be a solution for rural electric cooperatives is keep your tie to that grid, but if you can develop locally and serve on your own distribution grid, serve your members, you've insulated yourself from what could potentially be price volatility on the transmission system. Right. I think that would have appeal to the rural ideology that exists of not only being independent, but being insulated from price volatility. And so I think there's some potential there. But for a period of time, I don't know how long, we will certainly see a need for, and therefore continued, central generation with the model that exists today, with the transmission to take that power to where it's needed. I do think we're going to see regions, for sure, and maybe nationwide, continued development of renewable resources. And, if we go back 5 years, we were told, well, there's a maximum penetration of these intermittent resources that any grid can handle. And it was as low as 10%, maybe as high as 20%. And now we've all read the headline, Southwest Power Pool, 52% of their entire service area being served by wind power. We've seen California hit areas where it's over 60, 70, and 80%. So we found a way to manage this grid to still let those distributed generation resources come on and be used. And I think we'll probably continue to have a tug of war, so to speak, between wrestling with the grid and getting those resources on, and then probably the storage, challenge will be met, and we'll be able to see more distributed generation be put to use.
So I have a question about natural gas or fracked gas, Jim. Our last speaker on this subject, Patrick Cox, mentioned it in passing, and I would like you to educate us on the role of fracked gas or natural gas in this transition time that we're in, because we know that it's all around us. The infrastructure is growing as much as different people fight it, but everybody is talking about it as a bridge. It's a fossil fuel, so it's highly problematic in all kinds of ways. I'd like to just understand, because you mentioned it as well. Mm-hmm. Is this something that people are turning to temporarily? Please just explain it infrastructure-wise, and also what kind of a role it has now.
Sure, I'll do my best to answer that. Now, I will say, I worked in the oil and gas industry. My first engineering degree is a petroleum engineering degree, so I had some experience years ago with fracking. I then moved on. You might say I saw the light. I got my mechanical engineering degree and then evolved into the renewable side. What I'll say about fracking is hydraulic fracturing has been around for a long time and probably unknown by most people. And I think hydraulic fracturing can occur in a way that is going to impact the environment, because drilling for oil or gas is going to impact the environment. But it can be done in a way that didn't necessarily create some of the impacts that we've seen in more recent times. Having said that, however, one of the evolutions that's happened, it appears, and I've not stayed up to date necessarily on all of this in the industry, but it appears to me that they've gotten pretty good about these directional drilling techniques where they can go to one place and drill a host of wells from that one platform. Now, in one respect, that's good, because in terms of surface impact, it's not so big of an impact compared to the old methods. But because we've developed these directional drilling techniques and coupled them with hydraulic fracturing, it has resulted in this plethora of natural gas, okay? But it's also, we know from reports, resulted in additional environmental impacts, not the least of which is to the watersheds, and in many cases, groundwater. Now, everything I'm reading about it says that it's a bit undetermined by the studies as to what impact this is completely in every case. But I think we can all accept that there is an impact. So if it's hydraulic fracturing that's made cheap natural gas, and we think natural gas is potentially a bridge fuel from, a fossil fuel age with coal, oil, and gas being mixed for electricity generation, to coal now being pushed out a little bit, I think the Clean Power Plan, as it came out in its final form, went through an alteration. I think it initially was going to use that natural gas as the bridge fuel, and the comments that came back from the public and the people in industry, and in many cases the renewable energy advocates, were such that they said, we don't get to where we want to get to from a CO2 emissions perspective using gas as a bridge fuel. Right. And to the developers of the Clean Power Plan's credit, they read those comments, and the final version that came out, to me, in my opinion, went from gas as a bridge fuel to we got to make a much faster transition to renewables. Right. Okay, now we can all lament if we were in favor of that that tactic in the Clean Power Plan. The fact that, politically, we're probably not going to see the Clean Power Plan get implemented. But the fact remains, if CO2 emissions and their impact on climate change is ultimately what we want to make sure we address and avoid, then we probably can't count on gas as the bridge fuel.
Right.
Fortunately, depending on your side of the argument, gas prices are so cheap that for some period of time, it is going to be the fuel of choice. And it serves another purpose. In addition to being a lower carbon emission fuel compared to coal, it can be used in these internal combustion engines, the big Wärtsiläs or pick your brand, that are available, that have become more efficient, and can couple with intermittent wind and solar. In other words, they can come on quickly and go off quickly, as wind or solar itself comes on quickly or goes off quickly.
I mean, you're speaking as Jim, not DMEA, and but isn't part of our work to actually solve the other problem, to make it so it's not necessary to have that as a bridge fuel? And as part of a cooperative movement, isn't it also enticing, at least, to be stimulating that tradition and that sense of ownership and the sense of distributed power, rather than facilitating the creation of a new infrastructure that's further dependent upon and indebted to for the creation of infrastructure that isn't actually helping us get to a decarbonized power infrastructure and transportation infrastructure? I mean, and why? And maybe, I mean, I guess this rhetorical question, maybe, but also, with Solutionary Rail, one of the things that we incorporated into the book was that study by Christopher Alexander and the other folks from NOAA, et cetera, where they did the modeling to figure out how to get to 80% renewables by 2030. And they were much more disciplined about their how they went about their modeling than the folks who are, associated with Mark Jacobson, and there's been some critique of the Jacobson work, right, around 100% renewables. But the NOAA folks, they did a really good job on their modeling, as far as I can tell. And the crucial linchpin wasn't so much storage as it was high voltage DC transmission. And so I guess that I would like to use that as a pivot to ask you about any initial impressions, not assuming that you've had time to really dig into the Solutionary Rail idea, but initial impressions around how the use of railroad corridors for transmission could impact the culture, the business model, the approach of rural electrical cooperatives, and also potentially how the additional load, with a requirement for that load to be served by renewable energy, may impact strategies for further development of distributed renewable energy in the rural electrical cooperatives, either through as their own transition to being generating, having local generation that's part of your own grid and what you're giving to your customers, or this wheeling idea of remarketing it.
So yeah, first, if it were up to me and not me as a rural electric cooperative, I agree. We should go to decarbonization as fast as we can. We should skip to natural gas. But the reality is there's a price point. And if renewables coupled with natural gas, or natural gas as a bridge fuel, meets the price point that's most competitive, most of the members of my cooperative, I think, are going to say, well, price matters. So if we can decarbonize, skip natural gas, and be at the right price point, I think we'll do it. Okay, now, having said that, the idea of rail corridors as transmission corridors, and you're right, I have not delved deeply into it, but one of the biggest obstacles to more renewable development is that we can't transmit it out of its location where it's generated to the point where it can be used. And if rail corridors, and I think there's been some study that say, yes, they are strategically located to be able to be good transmission corridors. There's already an easement, there's a lot of things you can think about. Then I would intuitively, I would say, well, yeah, that should be some potential there that could definitely benefit more development of renewables, for sure. Now, in terms of adding the load, are there utilities that want to add load? Many of the rural areas that are served by rural electric cooperatives have seen load decline. They've seen a reduction because their economies have slowed down since the 2008 recession. In some cases, they've seen populations leaving. For whatever the case, in our own service area, we had 3 active coal mines that were major electricity consumers because they were underground coal mines. We're down to 1 now, and even its output is reduced. So we've seen large industrial losses on our system. Our residential growth that had been very robust prior to the 2008 recession is very flat, maybe now just coming back. And one of the things I see, not just rails, but also the transportation sector in general, is a place that I personally have advocated in our co-op that we should be out promoting electric vehicle charging stations, promoting electricity as the transportation fuel. And I would think that there's a vast number of the rural electric cooperatives in the same position as DMEA saying, can we increase sales by getting into the transportation sector? Now, we're not going to do it as small rural electric cooperatives, but we should at least be out promoting it because it's the product we sell after all. Now, ideally, if we could say, look, we're not just 20 or 30%, but we're 70 or 80% renewable. And let's hope in not too distant future, we're 100% renewable. And we have the ability to produce excess power compared to what can be consumed. Well, then we should be out looking to sell that because it has benefits that go beyond, but I will, beyond just the environmental aspect. You can take a conservative person who says, I see them, I have them in my service area. When I come into work, I go by a house in the community which I live outside of on my way into work that has a sign up that says coal keeps the lights on. And I think this is a remnant of those coal employees in the coal mines that lost their jobs. They're rightly so. They're hurting. I think some of them are bitter. And they see, in some cases, renewable energy as being what displaced them. I could sit down if they would want to have the discussion and talk about automation in the industry, price points of natural gas, and all of that. But ultimately, they don't care. They know they lost a job. Now, if you could talk to that person and say, you know what? We could create an industry in our service area that generates more electricity than we need to consume. And if we had rail corridors, or if we could convince the transportation sector to come over and start using electricity as transportation fuel, those guys would be on board. I guarantee you they would be on board. They're loyal to coal because it gave them a standard of living that they now don't have. And if we could offer them an alternative, I can't be 100% certain because I haven't talked to them, but I'm 99% sure they're going to be on board. They're going to jump on that industry right away. And by the way, I recently purchased a Chevy Volt because I wanted an electric vehicle. Okay, it's a plug-in hybrid in essence, but it's the newest version, whatever they have. My commute from my farm to work is roughly 15 miles. So I'm a 30-mile round trip. Let's say I go into town to run some errands and I'm a 40-mile day. That car, I can ride on electricity 100% of my day. And I can happily say I purchased that car in the end of September. We're now mid-July. I've only had to put gasoline in it twice. And I'm doing over 90% of my miles on electricity. Electricity as a transportation fuel, it's cheaper. It's more convenient, and I can set aside the environmental benefits. I'm just beside myself why, as whether it's NRECA or whether it's the electric utility industry in general, why are we as an industry not out promoting this and competing with oil and gas and saying, guys, we're a fossil fuel based industry too in terms of coal and gas. We're seeing renewables increase. I mean, it just seems like a potential marketing bonanza for the electric utility industry.
So I own one of Maryland's few plug-in electric mopeds. Now it only goes 3 miles, so it's a whole different idea, but it's still really fun to get around with that. I also wanted to mention that we've had other conversations with communities that are struggling with the devastating environmental impacts of diesel fuel emissions from trucks. So what you say rings true, for several reasons.
Yeah, you know, it's the thing that doesn't seem to get much attention in sort of larger media circles, but we still have an emissions problem, right? We still have, the transportation sector is still an emissions problem.
Yeah.
And I have not read information lately, but if I remember, and this is from some time ago, so it may be outdated, I hope it's still correct. What I remember reading was, even if we took the vehicle fleet and could somehow click our fingers and miraculously turn it into an electric vehicle fleet, and we still went with central generation coal power plants, one, we have a place where we can control some emissions because it's a point source as opposed to a mobile source. And it was the efficiency of the electric vehicles, the transmission system ended up being, you still got a net gain in emissions reductions. Okay, well, we can do way better than that, right? We can now fill these grids or go to these distributed generation programs and develop these projects so that, a good percentage of these vehicles are getting fueled from renewable energy. Your idea of getting the rails converted to electric, it's fascinating because in the little bit of time I had to read some literature on what you guys have produced, I haven't had a chance to read the book. This idea was something like 2% of the rail sector counts for 2% of the transportation. I think it was emissions perhaps, or maybe it was energy consumption. But man, think about it, right? Okay, so we're out here in rural Colorado. Denver, in the other side of the state, has grown to become large enough that there's light rail transportation stuff. And when you get to a city of that size, you're much better off on a rail system, right? I haven't been there for a couple of years now. I was there last year, a couple of years ago. But the metro system in DC, which has gone through some of its problems, but my goodness, I would never get a car when I was in DC because it was just so much easier to get around in their rail system. And so if you think, okay, right now it's largely moving freight, but if we could convert it to more, and this is a huge challenge, I understand, it's a psychological challenge, get people out of their cars and onto trains for transportation system, electrify that. What a fantastic accomplishment, right? I mean, we've tackled some of the transportation problems. We've put more people on a single vehicle, the train, instead of in their individual vehicles. So we've reduced emissions because we're moving them more effectively. And then if we electrify it, my goodness. And then we have a growth industry for the electric utility industry.
And trucking transport is a huge is an emissions problem, whereas the rail transportation is not really an emissions issue.
Okay.
Part of the reason for electrifying, it uses quite a bit of diesel. Obviously, BNSF is the second largest consumer of diesel to the Department of Defense. That said, the big emissions impact is actually getting the freight off of the roads and onto the track. And so, but then what we're discovering through our conversations is that it's not quite enough. The big issue with rail is the last mile. How do things get from the railroad to the warehouse or wherever? And maybe it's the last 50 miles, but in some cases now, the problem with freight rail is a lot of stuff doesn't get onto a freight train unless it's going 500 to 750 miles minimum. And then it gets to a big distribution center that's got thousands and thousands of trucks coming through each day, puffing out diesel fumes into these communities. And so that also has to shift. We're thinking it seems like it needs to be a much more ecological, almost mycelial network where there's shorter trips, faster trips, more regular service in order to distribute not just distribute the bad impacts of diesel, but actually open up the doors for the decarbonization of the trucking industry so that it's not having to move things 250 miles and doesn't have to be move on a diesel truck, but could actually also be a decarbonized electric vehicle. So there's a lot of aspects of the system, but I'm hoping as you go to this conference in Portland next week with NRECA, I'm just hoping that you'll have some interesting conversation with folks, and I'm hoping that you'll have a chance to look at the book ahead of that, because so many of the things you've said have been really interesting. The tax exempt status of these co-ops is also fascinating, because one of the key aspects of electrifying rail is avoiding the tax burden of the electrification infrastructure, and that would hit the for-profit railroad companies. So we've been, okay, governors, states, interjurisdictional cooperation entities, like what we're calling a Steel Interstate Development Authority. Right. Well, that might be interstate, organized by state departments of transportation, or it might be organized by tribes, because they would be able to use a tax exempt status. Perhaps it could be initiated by a confederation of rural electrical cooperatives. I don't know, but the fact that you all are already in the business of transmission and generation does lend itself to some logic, although I actually am still pretty attached to the poetry of the tribes owning it. I can really, from our conversation today, I really wonder whether how significant a role rural electrical cooperatives as a federation, or collections of those cooperatives, what an important role they might play in this.
Yeah, I would imagine that it doesn't need to be a mutually exclusive either or thing. The whole point of this is to create opportunities in rural communities that need some kind of economic boost.
I had a question. I've heard that renewable is cheaper than gas or coal, but it depends on where you are, I guess.
Yeah, Jim, I was wondering about that too.
Right. So under circumstances, it certainly can be cheaper it's cheaper than coal in many regions, and it can be cheaper than even natural gas. It certainly can depend on where you're located, and a big factor can be not just what it costs you to generate it, but the price you're going to pay to get it transmitted to your point of use. So it can definitely be a factor regionally, but there are documented instances, certainly, where wind in particular is cheaper than natural gas. Remember, though, we still have this grid that is intended to be there 100% of the time, and virtually, I won't say without, but virtually without any storage. So we have created a device, this massive machine. It's an incredible thing that is designed for just-in-time delivery all the time. And it creates a lot of problems. Nevertheless, from an engineering perspective, it is fascinating. So just being able to generate it cheaply doesn't mean it's delivered to the consumer cheaply. And gas has its advantages. It can be available when you want it without having to worry about what nature's doing. I'm convinced we're going to get both solar and wind and storage combined that's going to be cost competitive with the fossil fuels. I'm an optimistic person anyway, but I think we're probably just a matter of years away. I really think maybe on the order of 5 years.
And I think the stuff that you're doing is so fascinating. You're using current irrigation technology, or that's infrastructure that's there, and augmenting that. I mean, I'd never even thought that was a possibility.
There's a fantastic effort that's been done by the Bureau of Reclamation, and now I think Oak Ridge National Laboratories is working on it nationwide. What the Bureau of Reclamation did was they looked at two things: dams that are already constructed that aren't producing hydro, so what the potential to produce hydroelectricity there is, and then what they call conduits, that is pipes, open canals, channels, that also have the potential to produce electricity. And they've published the reports. And so just from developing renewables, because I'm going to be honest, hydro is in a tough spot. It takes a lot of money to build a hydro facility. I was at a conference at the National Hydro Association's conference was in Denver, Hydrovision. It's an international conference. And that was the major topic. How do we get that capital cost down for hydro? How do we make hydro plants that can not take as much concrete, not as much rebar, not as much steel, and still get the generation potential out. And there is some good work that's being done. I think we'll see some advances there.
Isn't another problem also the changing climate and the changes in precipitation that we're experiencing, especially in arid areas? I mean, it's unpredictable all across the country whether we'll have rain or how much or how little, and that's the same with snow. More so than it's ever been. I mean, we've as humans, we've always dealt with that unpredictability. We're seeing this at a new scale now.
No, I think you're absolutely 100% correct. Now, one of the aspects of our project is, yes, you got to have the snow and you got to have the rain. And the fact of the matter is, we know nature's going to give us years where we don't get adequate amounts. All right, well, if you look at it though, we've built a plant that's going to be around for hundreds of years. And most of the time, we can't project out another 100 years and know on the hydrologic cycle, but most of the time it's going to give us the ability to produce power. And so I do think you have to be responsible about where you do it. And then frankly, maybe Diane, maybe the bigger point is when we're trying to do these low impact hydros that are just run of the canal or run of the river, they may be a little more at risk because there's not a big storage reservoir behind there. Your point's well taken, and it should be evaluated to the ability that we can evaluate it in the future. But one of the thoughts I have is if you can do a run of the river and not have to build these massive concrete structures to get the plant in place or long miles of steel pipe, well, then we can take the risk and we can just put it in that flowing stream and we won't have as big a capital investment. If we have the dry years, we have them. I mean, it's a thought anyway.
Right.
And where they're going to be dry years, but they're also going to be, those dry years are probably going to be balanced by wet years elsewhere. So to me, that's actually another argument for why the cooperation across the grid and why another argument for the high voltage transmission and the capacity to let the variety of weather systems across as large a sampling of territory as possible be, in a sense, the battery and the balancing for the variability.
Yeah.
And that was the Sandy McDonald and that cruise, the NOAA folks, that seemed to be what they were saying with the 80% by 2030 strategy.
Just to shift gears a little bit, I want to make sure we get to this before we end the call. Who else around the country is doing work that is intriguing to you along these lines in rural electric co-ops? We spoke with Patrick Cox from Pedernales Electric Cooperative in Central Texas. He was very inspiring, and I know you're a little bit familiar with his story. Anybody else?
A co-op that comes to mind is in Vermont, and I believe it's Green Mountain Power, I think is what they're called. I want to say it's Green Mountain, and I believe it's not related to the green power, but I believe it's related to the name of the mountain.
Yeah.
But they've done, what I've read about them, they've done things ahead of a lot of other co-ops. They'll go out and try some early adopting. The last article I read, and what brings me to mind, is they were looking at these Tesla Powerwall 2s, and they were trying to come up with a method where they finance them, get them in their members' homes, and then use the dispatch of that battery during the peak demand periods, and looking at a financially viable way that they could basically use storage at the residential level. They've done some other stuff. I think the New Hampshire Electric Cooperative's done some interesting things as well. And theirs is largely, the stuff I'm familiar with them was related to energy efficiency and conservation efforts. So those two co-ops come to mind. In Colorado, Holy Cross Electric, which serves the other side of the mountains from us, not the Front Range Mountains, but they're in the Aspen area. They don't serve the city of Aspen. They're doing some innovative things. And their chief executive officer that was just hired, he came from the National Renewable Energy Lab. And it would be, his name is, I think Brian's his first name. His last name's Heneghan. It sounds a lot like Heneghan. That's why I remember it. But he, his perspective and how that's going to play in a rural electric cooperative that's now looking from an organization that was saying, how do we get renewable energy out there? And through NREL, through National Renewable Energy Lab, who's now running a cooperative. And it's still board governed, but the guy at the top is coming from a completely different background. There might be some interesting, information that he would provide to the story, so to speak. But those are ones that come to mind anyway, that I think are doing so. And I suspect there's a lot more. We're lucky. Colorado's served by electric cooperatives in large part in landmass. And we're just blessed with a lot of resources that are renewable resources. So I'd like to think that maybe DMEA spearheads some things, but I suspect there's co-ops that are ahead of us, and there's others that I'm just not aware of that are out doing similar things, and maybe even much more, progressive things.
Well, hopefully you'll all meet and have a caucus out in Portland and inspire each other then.
Well, I'm looking forward to the Portland meeting because it's part. This is a good plug for NRECA because they're a lobbying group in part, but they're an industry group as well. And the group that I'm meeting with is called a member advisory group, and the member advisory group that I participate in it's the distributed energy resource group. And we're also going to meet collectively with the demand side management group this time. So I'm looking forward to some good conversations, some innovative ideas. I know we're going to do some discussion on battery storage. We're going to tour a facility up in the Portland area. I know that there's also some talk about some microgrid stuff. So when I look at NRECA, I think these advisory groups they serve a wonderful purpose, and I do think they're looking at some more innovative and progressive ideas. So I will give a plug to NRECA for putting the effort forward on this.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. I really appreciate you taking the time, and everybody else who was able to join in. We've gone extra long just because it's been so fascinating. There's probably a lot of interesting things, and I'd hopefully continue a conversation sometime, Jim, about your experience with community solar, because we had some a very convoluted but generous renewable energy cost recovery program in Washington State, and but it was so convoluted that it had some. It was very difficult to actually implement at the community level, one of the questions I don't want to get answered today because I want to have another chance to talk with you about it is, what are the models for community distributed renewable energy, community wind, community solar that you're seeing in other places? And so maybe at another time we could discuss that.
Sure, that would be fantastic. Look forward to it. I really appreciate the time today. I enjoyed it. Thanks for everyone that signed on, and thanks to you, Bill and Diane, for getting a hold of me. It was an enjoyable time tonight.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. We're so grateful to you. And Diane, thank you for all of your work putting this together.
My pleasure. Thank you to everybody, and especially to Jim. This has just been fascinating.